Thank you for tuning in to Radicards.com. I'm your host, Patrick Greeno, and today we have online Ryan Daly. He's an advocate of fantasy baseball, and he keeps up with it in the West Coast market as often as he can. And we're here to discuss with you today um, the NLDS, the Cubs and Nationals, how that went down. Ryan will sort of host this conversation, and I'll pitch in when I can with dialogue around, performance related to the hobby and how cards are doing in relation to how the players have been doing with the playoffs. So, Ryan, why don't you start us off there, bud?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Patrick.
Of course.
So before we get to the Nationals and the Cubs, the other half of the NLDS equation was obviously Dodgers Diamondbacks. Kind of a less dramatic series. It was a pretty clean sweep by the Dodgers, but I was fortunate enough to go to Game 1 in LA. It's probably my first playoff game in about 15 years, so it's very exciting. um, and Clayton Kershaw gave up 4 home runs, and they still won the game. So I don't really think that bodes well going forward for the Dodgers. Clayton Kershaw has not had a very good history in the playoffs, unfortunately. I think he got lucky with some excellent offensive support, but if you can't beat the Diamondbacks in the first round of the playoffs, I mean, I don't really know how they're going to fare against the Cubs going forward, because the Cubs are just super fired up right now after that series.
Right.
So I don't know who's going to get the Game 1 start for the Dodgers. They have a couple different guys they could go to and maybe try and preserve Kershaw for more crucial games.
Well, they have Kenta Maeda. He's part of that crew.
So Kenta Maeda is a little bit of an interesting case this year because he struggled at the beginning of the beginning of the season. I actually had him on my fantasy team this year, and it was very frustrating to start him because he was not very productive.
Mm-hmm.
And the last I saw of him in the playoffs, he was coming out of the bullpen. So it's going to be interesting to see how they manage him. It's looking like it's not going to be in the starting role anyways.
Yeah, that's I haven't really been following Kenta's career. I know he's relatively new on the scene. I'm not sure how productive he's been with the Dodgers this season. I've always looked at Kershaw as one of those dominant pitchers that is consistent throughout the season. Now, I don't know his record in the postseason. I know it's a slightly higher level performance requirement to excel in that capacity. But
yeah,
I
don't know his record off the top of my head, but he's had a couple really famous gaffes, giving up home runs or giving up key hits. He's just not the dominant pitcher that he is in the regular season, and that's what makes the postseason so fun. Is just crappy players find a way to succeed, and amazing players fail. I mean, it's not fun if you're a Dodgers fan, but.
Well, I think that happens with all the teams, right? I mean, there are always going to be moments where, the people you've depended on to perform in critical times will, in some ways find a way to let something down. Now, I get it. Like, we as fans, as collectors even, expect our guys to perform at the highest level in the times that we need them most. But, these guys are just like any other human being, so they're going to stress out in these high level environments, specifically with the postseason, one of the most stressful times in Major League Baseball in the entire year for any player. So I can understand that. So I can't hold certain hiccups, certainly not against Clayton Kershaw, because the Dodgers have secured their place in the championship status, right, for this year. So they're going to go up against the Cubs. So they've done fine. And the Cubs, that's another conversation that we could have.
Yeah, the Cubs are looking good. Obviously, that sort of goes without saying. Their pitching has always been kind of a question mark to me because John Lester has been known to obviously been an amazing pitcher throughout his career, but he's been known to have complete blow-ups in certain games. So if if there was a Game 7 situation in this championship series against the Dodgers, I don't think you could go to John Lester. So then the question is, do you go to Jake Arrieta, who's another guy who, Cy Young Award winner a couple years ago, but he hasn't really achieved that level of performance ever again. Game 5 they went with Kyle Hendricks,
right?
And
he was dominant though.
Yeah, he was great. So that's just it's a managerial decision, and Joe Maddon's obviously one of the best managers in the game, so he knows what he's doing. But they have a weird lot of pitching over in Chicago, and I'm really curious to see who they start Game 1, just to kind of set the tone for the series.
Can I say something? Let me jump in and say that I didn't realize how dominant Doolittle. He was as a closer. I mean, to me, I didn't, I hadn't really been watching the season games at all this year, so I kind of came in at sort of a late time. I had to digest some of this talent, and Doolittle, I didn't know this name prior, and him coming in and doing his job just as he was supposed to do it. Still impressed by Doolittle's performance at in inning 9, and seeing him close out the games quickly. I hadn't been exposed to his talent previously, so it was nice to see somebody do so well in that capacity. Because we didn't have Steven Strasburg, we struggled in those first couple innings. We gave up a lot of runs. We had a head start in the beginning. It was 4-1, and then it just kind of crumbled after that. We gave up a bunch. Gio Gonzalez really struggled in those first couple of innings. So I even when they pulled him and put in Max Scherzer gave up even more runs. So I really had a hard time watching the first 7 innings because of that. It was difficult to watch. The performance was just wasn't where it needed to be in a position where success could have been a result.
Yeah, it was really hard to watch, and I'm not really technically a Nationals fan, but I am a fan of a lot of the players on that team, and they have a history of not being able to get past the National League Division Series. So I was really hoping that they would be able to squash the Cubs and actually move on to a championship series for once. I think, they're a relatively young franchise, so it's probably the first time they've been able to do that. Obviously, they weren't able to do that. The decision to start Gio Gonzalez is, you got to put yourself in Dusty Baker's shoes, I guess, because Game 4 was a must-win situation.
Right.
And so you got to go with your best pitcher, Steven Strasburg. But if you win, it's hard, because if you win Game 4, then you obviously have to win Game 5.
Right.
So do you save Gio Gonzalez for Game 5? Do you start him Game 4? I mean, it's hard to say. I feel like if I would have tried my absolute best as a manager to save Steven Strasburg for Game 5.
Well, that's the question, right? Is we in Game 5 we have Gio Gonzalez. If we didn't have Gio Gonzalez and we weren't going to use Max Scherzer, we'd have had to pick a third or fourth spot. Who would those guys have been, right? And would they have been as dominant as Gio or Max? That's the question. Obviously, we struggled with both of those options, but those were the next 2 best candidates after Steven Strasburg. And Steven Strasburg, for some reason, poor guy didn't feel well enough to take Game 5, but we really needed him there to solidify some prevention of runs from the opposing team. But that aside, if we weren't going to use Gonzalez or Scherzer, who would have we put in place? Because we shuffled around a couple guys toward the end there. Matt Madsen,
Ryan Madsen.
Yeah. He was pretty good in his time there at preventing runs. And do we put Madsen in the beginning, or is he one of those guys that's not quite a closer, but a reliever enough to be toward the later innings of the game? That's another question. I'm still getting used to Madsen too, but I think he was pretty talented.
Yeah. Madsen's kind of a journeyman guy. He was probably the best setup guy out of the bullpen for the Phillies back like 2009, 2010, and he sort of hopped around ever since then. But the one key thing I see to the Nationals' failure is Dusty Baker as the manager. I was very surprised when he got hired to coach the Nationals. This is a guy who has a long storied history of losing in the playoffs.
Yeah, well, this dates back to like when he was managing the Cubs, when what was it? Pryor and Kerry Wood were on the team, and he would pitch them into the ground essentially, and to the point where they just couldn't pitch anymore.
Yeah, he's an old school guy, and there's nothing wrong with old school baseball, but when you're going up against a guy like Joe Madden, who is like a modern Renaissance man of baseball, you can't just be one-sided about everything. You have to see it from every single side possible. And I think yesterday's game really shows that Joe Madden, once he sees weaknesses in your team's approach, if he starts to see your team crack in any sort of way, he's going to exploit it to the best he can. And that's exactly what happened yesterday. Dusty Baker, just for a brief history lesson, 2002 World Series, Angels-Giants, Joe Madden was the bench coach for the Angels. Dusty Baker was the coach for the Giants. So they have history together going back, 15 years. And who's been more successful over those past 15 years? Arguably, Joe Madden's been the more successful manager. I just thought it was weird when Dusty Baker got hired, the Nationals front office put all this effort into draft picks and sort of being a crappy team for so many years. And they finally have their hard work sort of come to fruition with guys like Harper, Strasburg, Anthony Rendon. And they get Dusty Baker to manage these young guys. Like, it just didn't make any sense. And I don't know what his contract situation is like, but I feel like if this is his last year of his contract, he's not really going to get hired again.
My biggest concern when I heard Dusty Baker was going to manage the Nationals was that I was like, well, there goes Strasburg's arm. He's just going to run him into the ground just like he did with Pryor and Wood back in their prime, right? And those guys didn't really get Hall of Fame careers because their arms essentially fell off after a while. So it was like I didn't want to see that to happen to someone so elite like Strasburg or any of those other guys we've been mentioning on the pitching staff of the Nationals. So that was my biggest concern when I heard that the Dusty Baker was going to manage the Nationals. And knowing how dominant Strasburg can be, in a lot of ways, he's one of the MLB's most prominent pitchers, right? So, I didn't want to see that. Baker has a history with mismanaging the pitching staff.
Yeah, he's I don't really get his place on that team. There were some interesting firings of managers towards the end of the season, specifically John Farrell on the Red Sox and Brad Ausmus from the Tigers. And these are guys that I think did a pretty good job considering certain situations they were put into during certain seasons. And, if the Nationals end up looking elsewhere for a manager, I mean, those guys must be at the top of the list. I think John Farrell would do a really good job with those young guys. Red Sox are a really young team, and he did a really good job with them. I don't really know why he got fired. I haven't read too much on those specifics. But, I would certainly look elsewhere. If I were the Nationals, get Dusty out of there.
So then let's turn this conversation into the hobby. So based on the performance of the Cubs and the Nationals from the playoffs this year, how does this impact card values for some of the players on these teams? Are we going to see right now, before we see World Series plays and wins, are we going to see an increase in value for Cubs items and a decrease in values for Nationals items? And this is the question. And do people buy low National stuff knowing it's cheap right now, or do they spend their money on premiums for Cubs items right now instead of waiting until after the buzz has died, say toward maybe the end of November?
Yeah, that's a great question. Me personally, if I wanted to put money into players from either of those teams, I would look at Max Scherzer just because he had such an embarrassing performance But overall, he's an amazing pitcher. He's the only guy that really is threatening to Nolan Ryan's record of 7 no-hitters. He's having his cards in your collection is definitely going to help your collection. And I assume his value will be going down over the coming weeks and months.
Mm-hmm.
Guys like Strasburg and Harper, I don't think something like this is going to affect the value. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think. Well, here's the thing with me is that Strasburg had a lot of hype to live up to in the beginning back in 2010, and it's impossible for any player to live up to that kind of hype. It's just not going to happen, no matter who you are. If you're Superman, it's still going to be hard to live up to that hype. So I get that. Values will never be where they were in 2010. I get that. But I still feel that Strasburg is a great investment. He had one of his best years in his career this year, and I'm proud of him. With Harper, again, he's really coming into his prime as a dominant hitter. And I honestly think that each individual player on the Nationals, expect that the prime guys, each individual ones are very good at their crafts. Now, it's the glue that molds them all together. It's the the dynamics that hold them together, how they work together offensively that makes them dominant when they're up to bat. But I honestly think that Strasburg stuff is undervalued presently. I think he's a fantastic pitcher. I haven't seen anybody strike that many guys out in a single game consistently. So many consistently, like 12 in game 4. 10. Yeah. I think he had 10. I think in game 3. I mean, these are high, very rare instances for a lot of pitchers, and have him that dominant consistently, I think is valuable for the investor. But that's just me. That's just me as I see talent, and so I'm going to want to get obviously his best pieces.
Sure.
But I think that you're right. He's approaching this 7 no-hitters, breaking Ryan's record, which is going to be a big deal if he does it. He's been in the league now professionally, I think, for what, 9 years? Is it 8 years? 9 years. And so he still has a good chunk of time left to be able to put himself in a position to possibly pull that off. And if that's the case, getting Scherzer rookie cards now on the cheap would be a good idea.
Yeah, I've thought about it for my own collection. I think it's something to look into. And one of the fun things about this season in general, and specifically the playoffs, is a lot of guys from like that 2010, 2011 Bowman Chrome draft pick era, which was very special, obviously because of Strasburg sort of leading the way. But there's a bunch of other guys that were on those checklists that are they're playing key roles on teams in the playoffs right now.
Right.
A
lot of them.
So just off the top of my head, I made a quick list before we started. I'm sure there are more that I'm missing. Dallas Keuchel, which, by the way, if you want to go on eBay right now, you can get a 2010 Bowman Chrome Blue Parallel for $200, which I think is a pretty good deal.
Nice.
Carlos Correa, Jose Altuve, Bryce Harper, Steven Strasburg, Anthony Rizzo, Addison Russell, Archie Bradley, Paul Goldschmidt, JD Martinez, Aroldis Chapman, Jason Kipnis. Now, some of those guys played for teams that have been eliminated in the past couple of days, but at the beginning of the playoffs, there were tons of guys from that era that were, they were the stars of the team.
Truly.
And it was just fun to think back to those times. That was a pretty special time in the hobby for me, and I know for you and for a lot of other collectors.
Yeah, that's interesting you brought that up, because I was thinking about that too. I was like, man, a lot of these guys I recognized from the 2010 Bowman Chrome run. Tons
totally.
of them. I was like, man, this is kind of fun to watch a bunch of these guys come together for a playoff season, right?
Yeah.
And I'm remembering the cards that came out that featured them, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is cool to see all these guys kind of like be showcased in October. The biggest month in the baseball year. So it's telling of the amount of talent we acquired in 2010 for baseball. These guys have been purchased by key teams that have built talent around them so that they can perform at the highest level and really make names for themselves. It's good to see Rizzo and Strasburg and Chapman come onto the scene now, they're, like I said, even though they can't meet the hype that was once surrounded them back in the day, they're certainly making their talent work for them, and I can really appreciate that. I think that Chapman's with the Yankees now.
He is.
And so I haven't been following his career since he left the Reds. But I know that he's had some success, and I think he still holds the record for the fastest pitch.
I think he does at 105 miles an hour.
Right.
So last year he was. Let me get this straight. It's a little confusing. He was on the Yankees. Yankees traded him in the summer at the trade deadline to the Cubs because he was going to be a free agent at the end of the year. So he was essentially just a rental for the Cubs. Right. But the Cubs were on the World Series trajectory, and that's what ended up happening, obviously. He had some pretty famous performances in the World Series. He gave up a key home run. Joe Madden left him in the game a little too long, which I think really proved that he is truly a one-trick pony. He can throw about 10 pitches, and then he's got nothing.
Well, I mean, when you throw that hard, how much longevity can you expect to have, right? It's almost like, dude, I can throw 105. Awesome. Do it one time, and then don't ever do it again. Because if you keep doing that, you're going to ruin your arm. So it's like pitching in like the 90s, I feel like guys can get away with. Some guys pitch slower. Some of these knuckleballers, they pitch slower, and then they're able to get away with it. I think that R.A. Dickey is one of those guys. Jim Bouton used to throw like that back in the 60s. And so,
I mean, R.A. Dickey's like 42 years old, and he's still out there, playing professional baseball.
That's admirable, though. I mean,
it's great. I mean, that's the kind of pitching that you need to do if you're going to be that age and continue to pitch.
To be that good at that age and still be that marketable it says a lot about your talent. So, but going back to it with Chapman, it would appear to me that his downfall would be the fact that he pitches too fast too frequently, and then he's he said 10 pitches and he's kind of done. But that aside, but I going back to it, the 2010 team, it's good to see them all, a good chunk of those guys kind of sort of together on the field, going at it for the World Series this year. Good stuff, man. I'm glad we got to talk about this. Do you have any final thoughts?
I think that's it for me. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It was fun.
Well, that's it for this episode, and thank you for tuning into Radicards.com, and thank you, Ryan, for joining us. And,
thank you.
And until next time, enjoy collecting. If you like this content, please subscribe. Thank you. Enjoy collecting.